Scene setting: winter of 1892 in Mexico City. In the winter of 1892, Mexico City's most prestigious neighborhood was wrapped in the kind of quiet elegance that the wealthy liked to believe would last forever. Gas lamps burned low along cobblestone streets, their light catching on the polished carriages of the elite as they rolled toward evening engagements. Yet beneath this refined surface, an unease began to stir. It started as a whisper, an odd sound heard late at night, too distant to be certain of its origin. But soon those whispers solidified into disturbing consensus. From behind the elegant pink limestone walls of a mansion on Tuba Street came screams, so sharp, so unrelenting, that even the most hardened men accustomed to revolutionary violence executions and the cries of the destitute would later admit that these particular sounds haunted their dreams for years afterward. They were not the cries of street brawls or drunken fights, nor even the desperate shouts of political uprisings common in Porfirio Diaz's Mexico. There was something profoundly different about these noises, a texture of agony so intimate it seemed to bypass the ear and settle directly into the marrow. In a city where people had learned to avert their eyes from unpleasantness, where poverty and brutality were as common as church bells, the noises from Tuba Street cut through every layer of denial. Something in that house was happening with deliberate cruelty, and those who heard it instinctively knew it was worse than anything they had encountered before. Yet, as was often the case in a society bound by class and deference, no one dared to knock on that door, not yet. The façade and the first hints of horror. To the casual observer, the mansion on Tuba Street was nothing more than another jewel in the crown of Mexico City's upper-class districts. Its wrought-iron balconies caught the afternoon light in delicate curls, and the stone façade carried the soft blush of well-maintained pink limestone. Within those walls lived Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano, a 43-year-old widow whose public life was the very model of respectability. She was known for her rigid Catholic devotion, never missing Sunday Mass, and for her generous contributions to the church's many charitable projects. Her late husband had been a man of means, and Guadalupe had preserved that fortune through shrewd business dealings, most notably a domestic placement service that supplied maids and cooks to the city's most influential households. To her peers, she was an emblem of refined morality, a woman whose stern posture and severe black widow's attire only underscored her dignity. But the surface was a mask, and behind it lay something far darker. Guadalupe had cultivated what she privately referred to as her special method of training servants, a method that, under the guise of moral discipline, satisfied urges she could never reveal to polite society. Those urges found fertile ground in the stream of young women who came to her from Mexico's poorest rural regions, desperate for work and completely alone. With no family nearby, no literacy to pen letters home, and no legal documents to prove their existence, these girls could vanish without the city ever noticing. And in the shadowed corridors of Guadalupe's home, vanish they did. The artist who immortalized evil. The events that would one day erupt from the mansion on Tuba Street would shock Mexico to its cultural and moral core, but they would also leave an imprint far beyond the courtroom. Among those who took note of the case was José Guadalupe Posada, already on his way to becoming Mexico's most celebrated engraver and illustrator. Posada was renowned for his ability to capture the hidden rot beneath society's polished veneer. and when the details of Guadalupe Bejarano's crimes emerged, he recognized in them a rare convergence of horror and hypocrisy. In his engravings, he would depict her not as a wild-eyed madwoman, but as she truly appeared to her peers, perfectly composed, elegantly dressed, calmly presiding over scenes of unimaginable cruelty. In doing so, Posada ensured that the story of Mexico's first documented female serial killer would not fade quietly into archival obscurity. His work would fix her image in the public imagination as a reminder that monstrosity often wears the face of respectability, and that evil, when clothed in social privilege, can move undetected for years. Yet even before Posada's ink touched paper, the whispers around Guadalupe's mansion were already growing louder, and the façade that had protected her for so long was beginning imperceptibly to crack. Soon, Mexico City would learn that the charitable widow on Tuba Street had constructed something far more terrifying than any Gothic fiction. She had built a private theater of pain hidden in plain sight. Mexico City in 1887, the stage for a predator. The year was 1887, and Mexico City throbbed with contradictions. President Porfirio Diaz's ambitious modernization project had transformed parts of the capital into showcases for European-style progress. Newly paved avenues gleamed under the flicker of imported gas lamps, and horse-drawn carriages carried ladies wrapped in Parisian silks past manicured plazas, where military bands played waltzes on Sunday afternoons. But these scenes of refinement were illusions of completeness. Just beyond the elegant boulevards lay overcrowded tenements crumbling under decades of neglect, where indigenous families from the countryside crowded into single rooms, their children's faces drawn thin with hunger. The smells of coal smoke and stale tortillas mingled in the narrow alleys, a stark contrast to the perfumed salons of the elite. This brutal division of wealth and opportunity was fertile ground for exploitation, especially for those shrewd enough to navigate both worlds. Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano thrived here. At 43, she was not merely a widow of means, but a woman, adept at preserving her late husband's influence through calculated charm and unassailable propriety. Her mansion on Tuba Street, with its polished balconies and meticulously swept entry, was a visual declaration of her place in the upper stratum. To the church, she was a model congregant. To her clients, a trusted provider of reliable domestic help. Few realized that this trust built on years of consistent decorum would become her most effective camouflage. In this city of contrasts, where the poor had no voice and the rich had no need to listen, Guadalupe was perfectly positioned to conceal the truth about the way she ran her household, and to ensure that when girls disappeared, no one of consequence would ask the right question. The public face of Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano. Guadalupe's life was a carefully choreographed performance in which every detail was calculated to reinforce her reputation as a woman of impeccable character. She dressed in the black of widowhood as though it were armor, the severe cut of her garments emphasizing her tall frame and sharp patrician features. Her dark hair was pulled so tightly from her face that not a single strand dared escape a visual metaphor for her precise control over her surroundings. In public, her tone was measured, her words deliberate, always framed in the moral language of faith and propriety. She attended Mass without fail, sat in the same pew, and offered generous contributions that priests would later describe in glowing terms. At charity events, she was seen discussing education for orphans, and relief for the poor, with bishops and well-connected matrons. Yet behind the closed doors of her mansion, she was engaged in an entirely different form of education. Her domestic placement business was more than a source of legitimate income. It was an acquisition channel for her private appetites. Parents from impoverished rural villages sent their daughters to her in the belief that she would place them in respectable service. The truth was that many of these girls never left her house at all. They arrived with nothing, no papers, no relatives in the city, and often no ability to write home, and were thus invisible to official record-keeping. If one vanished, there would be no formal investigation, no newspaper notice, only a vague sorrow in some distant hamlet. For years, Guadalupe restricted herself to what she called minor corrections, psychological degradation, and physical punishment that could pass as strict training. But the hunger for control is rarely satisfied by moderation. And in the winter of 1887, she would step beyond the threshold into murder, the creation of a special method. The seed of Guadalupe's cruelty had been germinating for years, watered by the peculiar blend of privilege and repression that defined upper-class womanhood in 19th-century Mexico. Publicly, she was expected to be pious, industrious, and a moral compass to those beneath her station. Privately, she harbored urges that polite society would not even permit her to name, much less act upon urges for absolute domination, for shaping the will of others through fear and pain. She called it her special method, though there was nothing accidental about its development. Over time, she refined it through observation and experiment. She noted how humiliation could be more lasting than injury, how withholding food could weaken resistance without leaving visible marks, and how a calculated rhythm of reward and punishment could unravel even the strongest sense of self. The recruitment of her victims was as deliberate as the methods she would use on them. She preferred young women from rural areas whose trust in authority figures was deep and unshaken, whose gratitude for a bed and food could be twisted into compliance. Once inside her home, they were subjected to constant surveillance. Every movement, every glance, every hesitation was catalogued in her mind. She learned to read fear in the tightening of a jaw, to measure hope by the way hands folded in a lap. And when she was ready, when she had mapped every psychological contour of her subject, she would begin. The punishments at first seemed like exaggerated discipline hours, standing in silence tasks, repeated until exhaustion. But beneath these exercises was a meticulous design. Guadalupe was not merely teaching obedience. She was dismantling the person in front of her piece by piece, so that when the moment came for real harm, there would be no one left inside to fight back. The arrival of Casimira Juarez. On the morning of January 18th, 1887, Mexico City awoke beneath a cold gray sky. A fine mist drifted over the streets, softening the edges of the gaslit lamps and muting the clatter of carriage wheels. It was in this subdued atmosphere that 16-year-old Casimira Juarez arrived at the mansion on Tuba Street. She had traveled for 6 exhausting days from the mountains of Michoacán, her meager possessions bundled in a square of faded cloth. Her life had been carved down to its barest elements, both parents dead from the cholera outbreak that had swept her village, no siblings, no land, and no prospects beyond the priest's thin promise of opportunity in the capital. In her hands, she carried the letter he had written recommending her to Señora Bejarano, a woman reputed to be a benefactress of rural girls in need of respectable work. When Guadalupe opened the heavy carved door, her gaze swept over Casimira, in an instant measuring her the way a jeweler might assess an uncut stone. The girl was young alone and radiated that fragile blend of hope and fear that Guadalupe found most enticing. Her simple dress, patched but clean, and her neatly braided hair spoke of discipline. Her wide eyes, full of gratitude, sealed her fate. With a cool smile, Guadalupe accepted the letter and spoke in a tone that carried the weight of command. Good references are essential in my household. I maintain very high standards. As she led Casimira inside past marble floors and heavy religious paintings, the girl's relief at finding shelter kept her from noticing the way her new employer's eyes lingered, not in kindness, but in appraisal. The first weeks. A carefully laid trap. At first, life in the mansion seemed almost gentle compared to the hardships Casimira had endured in the countryside. She woke before dawn to help prepare breakfast, swept and dusted rooms grander than any she had seen before, and learned to polish silver until it shone like water under sunlight. Guadalupe's constant watchfulness, the way her gaze followed her through every task, felt to Casimira like the natural supervision of a meticulous employer. She did not yet understand that she was understudy. Each reaction she gave quietly noted and stored away. Guadalupe was learning her rhythms, how quickly she obeyed a command, how she responded to criticism, which words drew the flush of embarrassment or the tremble of fear. For 2 weeks the girl lived in this fragile bubble of security, her small attic room holding a narrow bed, a basin, and a wooden crucifix. She prayed each night, believing she had been delivered to safety. But in Guadalupe's mind, the observation phase was ending. The results were satisfactory. Casimira's resilience was just enough to make the breaking worthwhile, her obedience pliable enough to keep her manageable in the meantime. Guadalupe began to plant the seeds of discontent, finding dust invisible to anyone else, declaring linens wrinkled that had been ironed to perfection. Meals prepared exactly to recipe were deemed poorly done. Each criticism came with an edge of cold disappointment that made Casimira work harder, chasing approval that would never come. In truth, the trap was closing. The girl's desire to please had become a lever that her mistress could pull at will, and soon the real purpose of the training would begin. The descent into torture, and the first murder. It started with punishments that seemed merely excessive hours, standing motionless in the kitchen for imagined mistakes. Meals withheld for minor stumbles, scrubbing floors on her knees until her skin split and bled only to be scolded for making a mess with the blood. When Aurelio, pale and nervous as a shadow, tried to speak to his mother about the girl's suffering, he was met with an icy threat. Perhaps you'd like to join her in her lessons about respect and obedience. He retreated into the fog of his laudanum, too frightened to intervene again. By February, the punishments had evolved into something far more deliberate. Guadalupe moved Casimira to the basement, a stone-walled space that had once stored supplies, but was now her private laboratory of pain. Here, stripped of her clothing in the cold, the girl was forced to endure the proximity of glowing hot irons, the anticipation often worse than the burn itself. Guadalupe inflicted wounds with surgical precision, tending them afterward with care not to heal, but to ensure the process could be repeated. Between physical assaults came psychological ones, forced confessions to sins never committed, expressions of gratitude for punishments that eroded her grip on reality. After nearly 6 weeks, Casimira's body, starved, beaten, and pushed beyond its limits, simply stopped. Her death brought Guadalupe a sharp, almost intoxicating satisfaction undercut by the practical concern of disposal. Wrapping the body in old sheets, she waited for the darkest hours before dawn to cart it to a vacant lot at the city's edge. As she dug the shallow grave, the cold night air seemed to sharpen her thoughts. The act had awakened something in her, something that demanded to be fed. She resolved to be more careful next time, more refined in her methods, but one thing was certain: there would be a next time: the arrival of Elena Santos. 9 months after Casimira Juarez's shallow grave was swallowed by the outskirts of the city, Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano received another opportunity wrapped in human form. In September 1888, Maria Santos arrived at the Tuba Street mansion with her 15-year-old daughter Elena. The Santos family had been ground down by drought and debt, losing their small farm to creditors. With no land, no livestock, and dwindling food stores, Maria's options were limited. She had heard of Guadalupe's domestic placement service through a cousin in the city and believed it to be a safe refuge for her only child. Elena, standing beside her mother on the mansion's front step, was the kind of girl Guadalupe favored, healthy, with broad shoulders from farm work, yet still graceful in her movements. Her eyes carried the calm endurance of someone who had worked hard all her life, and her quiet composure struck Guadalupe as a challenge. Breaking a strong spirit was always more satisfying than destroying one that had already been beaten down. The meeting played out like a rehearsed scene. Guadalupe received them in the grand entryway, her voice warm, her manner generous, explaining that she could offer Elena steady work, lodging, and moral guidance. Maria, too desperate to bargain, accepted without hesitation. As the mother left, Elena's gaze lingered on the closing door. She did not know it was the last time she would see her family. Upstairs, a small, tidy room awaited her, complete with a crucifix on the wall, a bed, and a promise of safety that was never meant to be kept. The refinement of cruelty. From the beginning, Guadalupe applied lessons she had learned from Casimira's death. Instead of escalating quickly, she would move with the patience of a predator, certain of her prey's vulnerability. In the first weeks, Elena's duties were straightforward, sweeping the grand halls, laundering linens, polishing silver. Guadalupe watched, just as she always did, measuring the girl's reactions, noting her emotional triggers. When she began to criticize, it was not with open hostility, but with feigned concern. "I notice you've been making more mistakes lately. Perhaps the city air doesn't agree with you. Some girls from the countryside never quite adjust to civilized living." The comment carried a double sting, insulting her origins while suggesting her inadequacy. Elena worked harder, eager to prove herself, but no amount of effort could satisfy her employer. Punishments began as mild corrections, standing in silence for hours, withholding meals for a lukewarm dish, locking her in the coal cellar overnight for perceived defiance. Days or weeks would pass before the next escalation, allowing the girl to adapt before pushing her further. This rhythm disoriented Elena, making it hard to see the pattern for what it was, a deliberate dismantling of her will. Aurelio noticed the changes in the girl's demeanor, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the mechanical way she moved, but when he spoke up, Guadalupe turned her scolding into a trap. "Would you rather I send her back to the streets where she'll surely fall into sin, or perhaps you'd like to take over her moral instruction yourself?" The veiled threat silenced him. He returned to his laudanum, retreating into the only refuge left to him. The second murder. By December 1888, Elena Santos had been transformed from a healthy young farm girl into a pale shadow whose obedience was absolute, her voice barely more than a whisper. Guadalupe's basement had been upgraded during the months of preparation, its stone walls now lined with devices meant for restraint, heat, and pain. The centerpiece was a chair-like apparatus custom-made by a blacksmith under the pretense of caring for invalids, but designed to hold a body perfectly still while granting the torturer full access. Elena's final ordeal was conducted with the precision of a stage play. For 3 days, Guadalupe alternated between savage cruelty and false kindness, tending to wounds she had inflicted hours earlier, speaking to Elena as if she were a soul being prepared for heaven. "Every soul must be purified before it can enter," she murmured, pressing hot metal against the girl's skin. Some require more purification than others. The religious justification was new, an evolution of her self-deception, allowing her to see herself not as a sadist, but as a savior. When Elena's heart stopped mid-session, Guadalupe felt not remorse, but irritation. The climax had come too soon, her meticulous pacing interrupted. She wrapped the body, transported it to one of several new burial sites she had identified, and covered the grave under moonlight. Weeks later, when Maria Santos came to inquire after her daughter, Guadalupe delivered a story polished to perfection. Elena had fallen ill after Christmas, become delirious, and left to warn her family of imagined dangers. The explanation was vague enough to be irrefutable. Maria left believing her daughter was somewhere on the road home, unaware that she lay in the earth, another hidden casualty in the mansion's growing history of horror, the professional phase of killing. After Elena Santos's burial under the cover of night, Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano entered what she would later consider her professional phase. The deaths of Casimira and Elena had done more than feed her hidden hunger. They had taught her invaluable lessons in method, patience, and the management of risk. She had learned to pace herself, to create believable exit stories for the girls who vanished, and to eliminate patterns in timing and burial locations. Now she could afford to wait for the perfect candidates rather than act on impulse. For nearly a year, she threw herself into respectable pursuits with renewed vigor. She organized charity bazaars to raise money for cathedral repairs, hosted luncheons for visiting clergy, and expanded her domestic placement service into a formal enterprise with ledgers, contracts, and the air of legitimacy. The dual life was intoxicating. By day, she was the picture of piety and industriousness. By night, she was a careful architect of cruelty, sketching out new configurations for her basement chamber and drafting lists of improvements to her training techniques. She refined her psychological approach, planning ways to fracture a victim's trust and self-worth without leaving overt evidence that might draw suspicion. Most importantly, she strengthened her public armor. Every act of charity, every display of propriety, every public appearance was a brick in the wall that shielded her private horrors from discovery. It was in this phase that she became not just a killer, but a strategist. The evolution of victim selection. With time, Guadalupe's approach to finding her next prey became almost scientific. Her victims were no longer chosen simply because they were vulnerable. They had to meet specific psychological and physical criteria. She sought girls between 14 and 19, young enough to be molded but old enough to withstand prolonged instruction without immediate collapse. Physical beauty was no longer incidental. It became part of her selection process, not for any romantic desire, but because attractive victims drew more public sympathy when they disappeared, making their eventual destruction all the more satisfying. Emotional resilience was another factor. Guadalupe had discovered that breaking a strong will yielded deeper gratification than crushing one already weakened by life's misfortune. To this end, she created subtle interview techniques cloaked as polite conversation to gauge a girl's character. She asked about family hopes and fears, listening for signs of determination or pride that could be dismantled. In this period, she also perfected her screening for social invisibility. The ideal victim had no local relatives, no education, and no means of communication with the outside world. Someone whose absence would cause grief in a distant village but no ripples in the capital. By the early 1890s, Guadalupe's network of informants, priests, employers, and even other domestic agents, had become unwitting accomplices passing along names of girls in need of work, never suspecting the true nature of the opportunity she offered. Managing Aurelio, the fragile witness. One of the few variables Guadalupe could not fully control was her son Aurelio. By now 25, he was a spectral presence in the house, his health eroded by years of laudanum and opium use. His pale skin, nervous tics, and vacant stare made him appear more like a convalescent than the heir to a respected household. To outsiders, his condition was the tragic inheritance of some family weakness. To Guadalupe, it was a liability she needed to manage. She cultivated the perception of his instability, arranging for him to be seen by fashionable German physicians who specialized in nervous disorders. The consultations served two purposes. They kept him sedated and ensured that should he ever speak about the true nature of her activities, his testimony would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a damaged mind. In public, she played the role of the devoted mother, sighing over his condition and funding every new treatment suggested, even as she privately ensured his dependence on drugs deepened. Aurelio, for his part, was caught in a web of fear and chemical haze. He suspected far more than he dared to confront directly, but each attempt to speak of it was met with veiled threats and cold reminders of who controlled the house and his fate. By the time the opportunity for her next and most ambitious project arrived, Aurelio had been reduced to a ghost of a man unlikely to intervene and even less likely to be believed if he did. The arrival of the Vega sisters. The spring of 1892 brought Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano, the kind of opportunity she had been fantasizing about for years. One April morning, a young woman named Esperanza Vega arrived at the mansion on Tuba Street, accompanied by her two younger sisters, Carmen and Rosa. They had traveled from the battered farmlands of Hidalgo, their family destroyed by a combination of political unrest and relentless crop failure. At 19, Esperanza bore herself like someone far older, tall with a quiet dignity that masked the exhaustion in her eyes. Carmen, 17, was more timid, her gaze flickering from floor to wall as if bracing for an invisible blow. Rosa, just 15, was sharp-eyed and alert, scanning every detail of the unfamiliar city with cautious intelligence. For Guadalupe, they were a perfect set of specimens, a strong leader, a vulnerable middle sister, and a clever youngest, all bound together by the glue of familial loyalty. This was exactly the configuration she had been planning for a living arrangement that would allow her to test a hypothesis she had long nurtured, that the deepest suffering could be extracted by turning love itself into a weapon. She welcomed them with warm civility, her voice rich with maternal reassurance. "It will be ideal to have sisters working together," she told them, smiling as if she meant it. "You can support each other through the adjustment period, and I find that family members are naturally more motivated to maintain the high standards I require." What she did not say was that their bond would be carefully dismantled, strand by strand, until it became the very tool she would use to break them. The strategy of division Guadalupe began her campaign with an almost invisible hand. For the first month, the Vega sisters were treated with what seemed like fairness. Their work assignments were reasonable, their meals adequate, and even the occasional afternoon off was granted to explore the city together. This period of false security was crucial. It allowed the girls to relax into their surroundings, to believe they had found safety, and to invest emotionally in their new life. Only when that investment was secure did Guadalupe begin to draw the lines between them. She praised Rosa's neatness in front of Carmen, then moments later quietly told Esperanza that Carmen's work lacked refinement. She complimented Carmen's dedication while suggesting to Rosa that Esperanza was slow to adapt to city ways. These small manipulations planted seeds of resentment and doubt. At night, in their shared quarters, each girl began to second-guess her own standing in the household. Guadalupe escalated the competition for privileges and extra portion. At dinner, a lighter workload, the right to attend her on errands in the city, until the sisters began to measure themselves against one another. She was careful never to make the divisions obvious. Instead, she allowed suspicion to ferment naturally, as if the distrust had been born between the sisters themselves. By June, they no longer spoke with the same easy warmth. Each believed she might be failing in some invisible way, while her sisters succeeded. It was in this fractured state that Guadalupe would introduce them to the basement, a place that would become the crucible of their undoing, the chamber for three. The basement of the Tuba Street mansion had undergone a transformation since the deaths of Casimira and Elena. Guadalupe had invested in new equipment, commissioning custom restraints from a blacksmith under the guise of caring for invalids. Now the room could accommodate multiple captives simultaneously. 3 chair-like devices stood in a semicircle, positioned so that each occupant could see the others without obstruction. The arrangement was deliberate. She had discovered that forcing victims to witness one another's suffering magnified their own, inflicting an emotional agony that was as potent as any physical blow. The walls were lined with implements, heated irons, leather straps, and a collection of medical instruments modified for pain rather than healing. A brazier stood ready in one corner, its bed of coals capable of bringing steel to a red glow. When the Vega sisters were first brought down, Guadalupe maintained her teacher's pretense. Some aspects of proper service require more intensive instruction, she explained, her tone calm, her expression unreadable. The girls were secured in the chairs, not yet harmed, but made to feel the unyielding bite of iron on their wrists and ankles. Then the demonstrations began, a brief touch of heated metal here, a sudden dunk into water just short of drowning, a calculated shock from a primitive battery device. Throughout, Guadalupe narrated in the same patient voice she used when discussing household chores, weaving in remarks that pitted one sister against the others. Carmen, see how your resistance makes this harder for everyone. Rosa, perhaps you should encourage your sister to cooperate. The effect was corrosive. In a single session, the chamber had ceased to be a place of mere discipline. It was now an arena where love, loyalty, and pain would be twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The slow collapse of sisterhood. By late summer of 1892, the Vega sisters no longer moved through the mansion as a single breathing unit, but as three drifting bodies orbiting a sun that meant to burn them. The chamber had done its corrosive work with ruthless efficiency. Esperanza, once the family's compass, now woke each morning already apologizing to Guadalupe, to her sisters, to God, for imagined failures she could not name. She flinched at Dr. Hinges and swallowed words before they formed, convinced that silence might be a form of protection. Carmen had retreated further inward. There were days when she answered to her name, and days when she looked past it as if it belonged to someone else. Sometimes, in the middle of scrubbing a step or folding a sheet, she paused to smile at a corner where no one stood, murmuring to a companion visible only to her. Rosa, quickest of mind and the last to surrender, could still muster a straight gaze and a coherent sentence, but her clarity only magnified her torment. She understood the design. She saw how praise was a blade and how hunger was a leash, how the chamber's semicircle forced them to watch each other's violation, rebranding love as complicity. And because she understood, she bargained. She told Guadalupe that she would learn anything, endure anything, if only Carmen could be spared. She promised to be better, quieter, more obedient, if only Esperanza could be left in peace. Guadalupe, who had anticipated this stage as a necessary plateau, granted concessions the way a hangman might loosen a knot and call it mercy. For a day, Rosa's workload lightened. For an evening, Esperanza ate a full portion. For an hour, Carmen was spared the basement. Then the balance shifted again, and the reprieve, because it had tasted like hope, returned as a punishment doubly sharp. At night, in their cramped room, the sisters lay awake with the lamps extinguished, listening to the city breathe beyond the shutters. A dog barking wheels on stone the distant hymn of church bells. Esperanza whispered a prayer she could no longer finish. Carmen giggled, then wept, then slept as if dropping through a trap door. Rosa stared at the ceiling and counted her heartbeats, willing them steady. They could still touch hands in the dark, but even that gesture had changed. It was no longer the warm clasp of solidarity. It was the cold grip of those who know they are falling together and cannot slow the drop. When Guadalupe summoned them, each rose at once, trained to the rhythm of the house, to the click of her heels in the corridor, to the slight pause before she spoke their names. 3 lives, braided by blood, unbraided by design, now frayed at the ends, each strand ready to snap. Aurelio's fear and the first act of courage. Upstairs, behind doors that smelled of laudanum and dust, Aurelio rehearsed cowardice the way other men practiced scales. He told himself that he was sick, that he was weak, that his mother's eyes could stop a clock. He told himself that the city was indifferent, that the church was busy, that the police had no reason to believe a stammering invalid whose hands shook even when he slept. He filled lined pages with these truths until they sounded like excuses, and then, to his surprise, like lies. The house had become a clock with one hand Guadalupe's. It measured time not in hours, but in sessions, not in meals, but in punishments, not in seasons, but in scars. He could feel the weight of it pressing through the floorboards, a low, continuous pressure that made the glassware hum. Some evenings, when the coals in the brazier were at their hottest, he swore the heat reached his room. He tried to speak twice and failed twice. The first time he intercepted Guadalupe in the hall and asked, voice-breaking, whether the girls were unwell. She turned slowly, pity arranged precisely on her face, and placed a cool hand against his cheek. Compassion, she said, requires wisdom. Would you like to learn the difference? He nodded no, and she smiled as if forgiving him. The second time he wrote a letter he did not send. It began with Father Herrera and ended with a wet smear where his pen had rested too long. After that, he did not try again for weeks. It was Rosa's whisper that altered his orbit. He met her once in a corridor by accident, a tray between them like a shield. Her lips barely moved. Please. A single word so thin it might have been a draught. He took 2 more doses that night and dreamed of doors. In the morning, he woke to find his hand had kept moving after sleep claimed him. The journal's latest entry contained not fear but facts, dates, times, implements, names. He drew the basement the way a man recalls a battlefield angles, distances the place where courage goes to die. The drawing steadied him. He copied it 3 times, hid one under the carpet, one behind a loose board, one inside the lining of his coat. He began to test the back gate, oiling a hinge on the pretense of fixing a squeak. He noted the watchman's route and the way street sounds peaked at dusk. Terror did not leave him. It learned to walk beside him at a manageable pace. When he finally pressed his palm to the rectory door, breath short, he found no words prepared. But the journal spoke for him, and the priest's eyes, while horrified, did not look away. It was the first time in years that Aurelio felt a future choose him. The cracks in Guadalupe's mask. Guadalupe had always considered presentation a form of sacrament, black silk, properly brushed hair, pinned without error gloves, immaculate even when the world was filthy. But cruelty, like fever, consumes what feeds it. By December 1892, the edges of her ritual were fraying. She still woke before dawn, still moved through the parlor like an officiant, still arranged flowers with the exactness of a surgeon. Yet the mirror began returning small betrayals. Her cheeks had hollowed. Her eyes, once merely stern, now shimmered with a brightness that belonged to sleeplessness more than zeal. Servants, those not yet in training, learned to avoid her gaze, not because it was cold, but because it flickered. She spoke aloud when alone replies cued to questions no one had asked. At table, she conducted imaginary conversations about improvements and intervals, tapping patterns against the wood with a fork as if marking a metronome only she could hear. The public face, though, had its own momentum. She continued to donate to organized, visit bishops, and inspect orphanages with maternal gravity. She hosted 2 gatherings that winter and was, by all accounts, exact and gracious. Yet even the gracious noticed something, a tilt in her attention as if the room were always a fraction to her left. One afternoon, a parish priest arrived unannounced to deliver receipts and discuss Lent. He was kept waiting. The house, usually a cathedral of quiet, carried a sound beneath silence, like a kettle insisting from 2 floors down. When she entered, her cuffs were crisply buttoned, but a thread clung to one wrist, and a scent, faint but unmistakable, rode the warm air. Behind her burned metal-boiled linen something sweeter and worse. He asked if someone was ill. She smiled with the patience of a saint and said fever could be theatrical. The priest left with a receipt, and a doubt that collected others the way a coat collects ash. Outside the mansion, rumor moved with winter's breath. A blacksmith, pressed by conscience or curiosity, remarked on a chair for an invalid that required a geometry of straps he had not seen in hospitals. A doctor chalked up a request for certain instruments to the eccentricities of the very rich and then confessed privately that he had dreamed of clamps for a week. In the neighborhood, food deliveries shrank while the household allegedly grew. And Guadalupe, who heard everything, tasted the air and decided the wind had shifted. She redoubled the schedule in the basement, not from panic, but from urgency, as a painter works faster when the light is failing. Yet urgency is its own betrayal. Precision faltered at the edges. A stain appeared where no stain should be. A lock was turned twice, but not a third time. The mask remained on her face, but its straps were loosening, and the city finally had begun to look up. The crescendo of cruelty. As the final weeks of 1892 bled into the bitter cold of January 1893, the basement of the Tuba Street mansion had become less a hidden chamber than an extension of Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano's own will. The sessions with the Vega sisters no longer followed the slow, calculated escalations she once prided herself on. Instead, they churned forward in long, unbroken marathons of degradation, each designed to explore a new extremity of endurance. Esperanza was now a ghost inhabiting a body, her mind fractured into pieces too small to reassemble. There were days she sat in the restraint chair without flinching, her gaze fixed on some point deep within herself. Other days she erupted into sudden storms of screaming and prayer, the two merging into a language even Guadalupe could not entirely parse. Carmen's decline had taken a different shape. She was lost to a world of private phantoms, speaking to absent friends, laughing at terrors, crying at silence. Her moments of lucidity were rare and usually coaxed out by deliberate provocation, a threat to harm one of her sisters, or a sudden withdrawal of the tiny comforts she clung to. Rosa, the youngest, remained the most painfully aware. Her body was thin, marked in a map of bruises and burns, yet her mind still grasped the full measure of what was happening. She could anticipate her captor's moods, calculate the pattern of the day, and foresee the next torment before it arrived. This clarity paradoxically only deepened her suffering. She understood the inevitability of their deaths and the futility of bargaining, yet she continued to attempt it, if only to postpone the inevitable. Guadalupe found this dance intoxicating, the cycle of raised hope, partial relief, and inevitable betrayal. But even as she basked in her own invention, she recognized that her current subjects were nearing the end of their usefulness. Bodies, no matter how resilient, break, and once broken beyond repair, they could no longer provide the sensations she craved. It was this realization that planted the seed for her fatal miscalculation, the temptation of a new victim. The miscalculation came in the form of a widow named Julia Mendez and her 14-year-old daughter, Isabella. They arrived from Querétaro seeking work after losing their farm to creditors. Isabella was slight, with intelligent eyes and a posture that suggested she was used to hard labor, but not yet hardened by it. Guadalupe's interest sharpened the moment she saw the girl. She was the ideal candidate, isolated, compliant in demeanor, and without any connections in Mexico City. Yet acquiring her posed a logistical problem. The basement was already full, and the Vega sisters, though near the end, were not yet disposed of. A more cautious predator would have waited for nature, or continued abuse to finish the job. But caution was losing its grip on Guadalupe. The hunger for a new subject, one untouched by her current experiment, had been growing for months. She convinced herself that she could accelerate the deaths of the Vega sisters without drawing suspicion. After all, no one was looking for them. No one had the power to challenge her. She began structuring final sessions for each tailored to push their bodies past the last threshold of survival. In her mind, this was efficiency, a way to clear the space while savoring the climax. What she did not account for was that upstairs Aurelio had shifted from passivity to preparation. His journal, once a secret catharsis, had become a dossier, complete with maps of burial sites, inventories of instruments, and detailed accounts of victims' conditions. More importantly, those pages had already left the mansion carried in increments to Father Herrera, who was quietly determining how to act without losing the only witness willing to betray Mexico City's most respectable lady. Aurelio's alliance with the priest. The alliance between Aurelio and Father Herrera was as improbable as it was dangerous. Aurelio, long crippled by fear and sedation, had never before placed his trust fully in another person. Herrera, for his part, was not accustomed to navigating the treacherous currents of elite scandal. His work was pastoral, not political. Yet, as the evidence accumulated, drawings of the basement records of missing girls and Aurelio's own haunted testimony, the priest understood that delay was as lethal as action. The difficulty lay in the nature of Guadalupe's public armor. To accuse her without proof so absolute it could not be ignored would be to invite ruin not only upon himself and Aurelio, but upon anyone connected to the investigation. Rumors were one thing. They could be dismissed as envy or slander. But a raid on the home of a woman praised from the pulpit by archbishops would require a blade of evidence sharp enough to cut through layers of deference and disbelief. Herrera began to move cautiously, reaching out to select members of the civil authorities, testing for sympathy and discretion. Some were hesitant, unwilling to stake their reputations on a case that might collapse under the weight of social influence. Others were quietly receptive, especially those who had heard their own troubling whispers about the Bejarano household. The turning point came when Aurelio agreed to a step that terrified him more than his mother's wrath. He would grant the authorities direct access to the basement, timing their arrival to coincide with one of her extended instruction sessions. The risk was monumental. If she suspected him before the plan was in place, there would be no second chance. Yet the thought of Isabella Mendez descending into that stone-walled room before the Vega sisters had even been removed filled him with a dread that eclipsed his own survival instinct. For the first time he saw clearly that the only way to save himself was to destroy her. The night of February 14th, 1893, Valentine's Day in Mexico City, passed quietly that year for most residents. Couples took slow walks in the cooling dusk. Shopkeepers closed early, and the lamps along the Paseo de la Reforma burned steadily against a crisp, still night. But inside the mansion on Tuba Street, Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano was preparing what she intended to be the grand finale of her work with the Vega sisters. The brazier glowed in its corner, the chairs had been adjusted for optimal restraint, and her selection of tools was laid out in perfect symmetry on a table beside her. This was to be the final session, not because the sisters had served their purpose entirely, but because Guadalupe's appetite for something new, Isabella Mendez, had become unbearable to postpone. Above her, Aurelio paced the confines of his room, his heart matching the clock's ticking in erratic bursts. He had spent days rehearsing the sequence, unlocking the rear entrance, leading the small group of investigators through the narrow service corridor, and positioning them outside the basement door, without alerting his mother. Every moment before this night had been an act of endurance. This night was an act of defiance. As the clock neared 10, he stepped into the hallway, his movements slow and deliberate, each one threatening to betray him with noise. Outside, Father Herrera waited in the shadows, with 3 officers, men hand-picked for their discretion and their ability to keep their tempers, should the rumors prove true. Aurelio's hand trembled on the final lock. Not from laudanum this time, but from the raw awareness that when the door opened, nothing, his life, his mother's life, the city's understanding of itself, would remain the same. The basement exposed. The door opened with a sigh of hinges, and the investigators descended into the airless stone chamber. What they found did not merely confirm Aurelio's account, it exceeded it in ways that would later haunt their private hours. The 3 Vega sisters were secured in the restraint chairs, their bodies reduced to pale, shivering sculptures of pain. Esperanza's head hung forward, her breathing shallow, the rise and fall of her chest barely perceptible. Carmen's eyes were open, but unfocused tears slipping soundlessly down her face, her lips moving in an inaudible conversation with someone not there. Rosa, though thinner, bruised, and trembling, was still alert enough to see the uniforms and mouth a single shattering word: please. Around them, the room spoke its own testimony. Chains with the sheen of repeated use hung in lazy arcs from the ceiling beams. Implements blackened by heat lay in neat rows, their handles polished by the hand that wielded them. Medical instruments, scalpels, clamps, needles had been altered in ways no legitimate doctor would condone. Against one wall stood a narrow shelf where personal items, a ribbon, a locket, a small comb, were displayed like trophies. And there, in the center of it all, was Guadalupe. She turned to face the intruders with the calm of someone greeting unexpected guests at a dinner party. Dressed in a formal black gown that looked almost ceremonial, she still held a thin metal rod in her gloved hand, its tip darkened from the brazier's heat. "Gentlemen," she said evenly, "I assume you have proper authorization for this intrusion into my private household affairs." The words delivered without tremor or haste confirmed something the instruments alone could not. She did not believe she had committed a crime. The arrest and immediate aftermath. The shock of the scene was so great that 2 of the officers gagged, turning their faces away. A third had to be physically restrained from crossing the room to strike Guadalupe. Father Herrera moved to the sisters, first his voice low, urging them to hold still as the bindings were removed. Rosa clutched at his sleeve, her fingers ice cold, while Carmen simply sagged against the chair's frame when her restraints fell away. Esperanza did not stir at all. Aurelio, pale but steady, stood by the doorway watching as his mother's world collapsed. The evidence was overwhelming, physical, photographic, and written in her own hand. Her journal, stacked neatly on a side table, documented years of cruelty with the precision of a laboratory, log dates, descriptions, and the psychological insights she had drawn from each victim's suffering. The officers led her upstairs in silence, their boots loud against the marble steps. Outside, the street was empty, save for the carriage that would take her to Holding. The mansion's front windows reflected the lamplight in dark blank squares, as if the house itself had closed its eyes. News of the arrest moved quickly, but disbelief moved just as fast. In the parlors of Mexico City's elite, some refused to accept it outright. Others whispered that the evidence must have been fabricated by rivals or enemies of the church. Yet in the working-class cantinas and market stalls, the story took root without hesitation. The screams from Tuba Street had been real all along, and now they had a name. For the first time in her life, Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano was not the woman people sought out for placement, charity, or moral guidance. She was the woman everyone crossed themselves to forget. The courtroom spectacle. When Guadalupe Martínez de Beharano was brought into the courtroom for the preliminary hearings, the space seemed smaller than usual, pressed in by the weight of bodies and expectations. Journalists filled the benches along the back wall, their notebooks already open, their pencils twitching with anticipation. Social reformers, some of whom had long warned about the exploitation of domestic servants, crowded shoulder to shoulder with curious citizens, eager for a glimpse of the notorious widow from Tuba Street. She entered in her usual black attire, perfectly groomed, despite her confinement, her posture as erect as if she were attending Mass rather than standing trial. There was no slump of shame, no flicker of apprehension, only the controlled presence of a woman who still believed herself to be in command of the situation. When asked to explain the moral instruction of the Vega sisters, she addressed the court with the patience of a teacher explaining first principles to an inattentive class. "These girls," she said evenly, "came to me as ignorant country peasants. They had no understanding of proper behavior or moral responsibility. My instruction was to purify their spirits, to prepare them for a better life here and hereafter." She acknowledged the discomfort her methods sometimes caused, but dismissed it as necessary. The words sent a ripple of unease through the room, not because of their content alone, but because of the calm certainty with which they were delivered. Behind her on the evidence table sat the journal's photographs of the basement and the altered instruments of torture, each item a silent rebuttal to her claims. Yet to watch her speak was to understand why she had gone undiscovered for so long. Her composure was a fortress, and she had spent a lifetime perfecting it. Posadas illustrations. Among the crowd in those first days was a man who would ensure that Guadalupe's name would never fade from public memory, José Guadalupe Posada. Already known for his engravings that mingled social commentary with biting satire, Posada saw in her case a convergence of moral rot and societal hypocrisy too potent to ignore. He attended proceedings not just for the facts, but for the details, the angle of her chin as she addressed the judge, the crisp line of her dress sleeves, the way her gloved hands rested on the defense table as though she were presiding over a salon. In the weeks that followed, his studio became a crucible for distilling the trial's essence into images. The most infamous engraving depicted her in the basement chamber, serene and composed, surrounded by the instruments of her instruction, while three shadowed figures, the Vega sisters, sat in restraints behind her. There was no wild hair or screaming mouth in Posada's rendering. Instead, he captured the unsettling truth that evil often wears the face of refinement. The prints, sold rapidly in Mexico City's plazas, tacked up in cantinas and pasted to market walls. They crossed social boundaries in a way court transcripts never could, carried by hawkers' shouts into neighborhoods where news traveled on rumor and imagery. In the homes of the wealthy, they were sometimes hidden in drawers, as if to acknowledge them was to invite contamination. But hidden or displayed, the engravings worked their way into the cultural bloodstream. They reminded everyone who saw them that cruelty could flourish behind lace curtains, and that piety, when worn like armor, could conceal an arsenal. The verdict that shocked the public. The trial stretched into the late summer of 1893 each day, peeling back another layer of the façade Guadalupe had constructed over decades. The prosecution presented the surviving Vega sisters, Rosa pale and trembling, Carmen so lost in her private delirium that she could not recognize the courtroom as living exhibits of the suffering inflicted on them. Medical experts testified about the precision of the injuries, noting the deliberate placement of burns, the controlled infliction of wounds designed to heal just enough for the process to be repeated. Burial sites, revealed by her own journals, yielded the remains of Casimira Juarez and Elena Santos, the evidence of their fate-matching entries in her meticulous records. By the time closing arguments were heard, there was no doubt in the public mind as to her guilt. The doubt lay in what the court would dare to impose. When the verdict came guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of torture and assault, the announcement was met with a swell of approval in the gallery. But the sentence that followed sucked the air from the room: 10 years and 8 months in prison. No death penalty, no life sentence. The explanation was couched in legal language: the inexperience of the system with serial crimes, the prevailing reluctance to impose the harshest penalties on women. But outside the courthouse, the reaction was simpler outrage. In the markets, people called it a mockery. In the salons, they called it a tragedy. And in the shadows of the city, where memory lingers longer than official record, it was understood as a warning that even when unmasked, some predators are not fully caged. The fate of the Vega sisters. The legal judgment against Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano may have closed the courtroom chapter, but for the Vega sisters, there was no clean ending. Esperanza, the eldest, never truly left the basement on Tuba Street. Her body, already ravaged beyond repair, lasted only weeks after her rescue. She died in a hospital bed in early October 1893, her breaths shallow until they simply stopped. Carmen, the middle sister, survived physically, but not in any sense that resembled life. She spent her days in an asylum, her face often turned toward a window she did not seem to see, murmuring to companions only she could perceive. Rosa alone was able to speak coherently about what had happened, but her survival was a fragile thing. She carried an invisible weight: guilt for living when her sisters had not, shame for the bargains she had tried to make with their tormentor, and a constant fear that monsters like Guadalupe could walk freely in the world. Interviews with her were rare, and each left her visibly shaken, her voice thinning to a whisper when asked to recall the chamber. "It doesn't leave you," she told one reporter. "The walls, the smell, the sound of her walking. It doesn't leave you." Rosa eventually withdrew from public view, retreating to a distant relative's farm where the rhythms of rural life could duel, though never erase the memories. For the public, the Vega sisters became symbols. Their faces, when they were shown at all, were invoked in sermons, charity appeals, and reform petitions. But for those who had seen them in the basement or at the trial, they were not symbols. They were 3 lives, twisted out of shape by one woman's hunger, proof that some wounds do not heal in flesh or spirit. Life in Carcel de Belén. Guadalupe's sentence consigned her to Cárcel de Belén, one of Mexico City's most notorious prisons, a sprawling complex where the smell of damp stone and human sweat seeped into every surface. Word of her crimes reached the inmates before she did, and in that closed world, even hardened thieves and killers drew their own lines. Harming children placed you beyond redemption. For her own safety, the warden ordered her into near solitary confinement. She spent 23 hours a day in a narrow cell whose single window admitted little more than a stripe of daylight. The remaining hour was for exercise in a small courtyard where the air was thick with muttered curses and the occasional projectile hurled from an upper tier. The guards, many of whom had daughters of their own, did little to shield her from verbal assaults. Even here, Guadalupe maintained a version of her old habits. She wrote endlessly in new journals, sketching out theoretical improvements to her methods and speculating on human nature with the detachment of a self-styled scientist. She treated her incarcerations not as punishment, but as an enforced sabbatical, a temporary interruption to her work. Yet the prison environment exerted its own pressure. The absence of victims left her adrift. The control that had defined her identity evaporated. Deprived of the structure she had built around her cruelty, her health began to decline. She lost weight rapidly, her once precise grooming slipping. For the first time in her adult life, she had no one to command, no one to study, no one to break. Death without mourning. By the winter of 1895, Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano was no longer the imposing widow of Tuba Street, but a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure whose voice had shrunk to a rasp. The official record would later state that she died of pneumonia in her cell, but within the prison a different story circulated that a group of inmates had taken advantage of a guard's brief absence to settle their own judgment. However she died, the end was without ceremony. No family came forward to claim her body. No friends petitioned for her burial in consecrated ground. A priest performed a brief obligatory service before she was lowered into a common grave. The newspapers, which had once dedicated entire columns to her case, gave her passing only a few lines bare facts without eulogy. Outside the prison walls, life moved on. The mansion on Tuba Street stood empty for a time before changing hands, its history whispered about but rarely acknowledged. And yet in certain neighborhoods, people claim that on windless nights you could still hear faint echoes of screams carried through the narrow streets, as if the walls themselves had refused to forget. In death, Guadalupe was stripped of everything she had used to shield her self-wealth status, the veneer of moral authority. What remained was her legacy, a cautionary tale of how far cruelty can hide behind respectability, and how many will look away until someone forces them to see. The systemic failures. When the dust of the trial settled and the prison gates closed behind Guadalupe Martínez de Beharano, the uncomfortable question lingered: how had she been able to operate for so long in plain sight? The answer, when unraveled, was a tapestry of systemic failures woven from indifference, complicity, and social hierarchy. Police records showed that in the years before her arrest, at least 4 families had traveled to Mexico City searching for missing daughters. Each time their reports were quietly dismissed, not for lack of evidence, but because they were poor, rural, and without the influence to demand action. Probably runaways officers had said scribbling perfunctory notes before closing the matter. The medical community did not fare better under scrutiny. Physicians had provided Guadalupe with surgical instruments, sedatives, and anatomical texts without ever questioning why a woman who did not practice medicine needed them. Some admitted privately that they had been uneasy, but fear of offending a wealthy patron outweighed their sense of duty. Even the church, often the last refuge for the voiceless, had played its part in the silence. Parish priests had praised her generosity from the pulpit, while ignoring whispered rumors from servants who escaped her employment. More damning still was the elite's collective will to look away. Many in Mexico City's upper class had suspected she was capable of cruelty, but confronting her would have meant challenging the fragile social order that kept them secure. It was easier, safer to let the poor bear their losses quietly than to risk scandal in the salons. Guadalupe's crimes thrived in these blind spots, exploiting the very structures meant to safeguard the vulnerable. The legal reforms. The Bejarano case ignited a fire under reformists who had long argued that Mexico's justice system was ill-prepared to handle crimes of prolonged and systematic violence. In the year following her conviction, lawmakers introduced measures that would change how missing persons cases were handled. Reports could no longer be dismissed based on the social standing of the complainant, and police were required to investigate regardless of the victim's background. Medical suppliers faced stricter oversight. Any sale of surgical or restraining equipment to private citizens now required documentation of its intended use. Perhaps most significantly, the law formally recognized the concept of serial murder, a category that carried enhanced penalties and broader investigative powers. For many, these reforms came too late. Casimira Juarez, Elena Santos, and the Vega sisters would not return from the grave or the asylum, but they marked a shift in how the nation thought about its own vulnerability. The case also led to discussions about the regulation of domestic placement services, though change in that area was slower, hindered by the same economic forces that had driven so many rural families to send their daughters into service in the first place. While the new laws did not guarantee that another predator like Guadalupe would never emerge, they did ensure that the next would face a society slightly less willing to turn its head. Cultural memory. If the legal system recorded Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano in statutes and case law, the Mexican people recorded her in memory, folklore, and art. José Guadalupe. Posada's engravings remained in circulation for decades, their stark lines and chilling composure serving as a reminder that evil can smile, wear gloves, and quote scripture. In markets and cantinas, her name became shorthand for hidden cruelty, a cautionary reference parents used when warning their daughters about the dangers of trusting strangers, even respectable ones. The mansion on Tuba Street, long after changing ownership, acquired a reputation that no renovation could erase. Workers claimed tools went missing, that strange drafts whispered through sealed rooms, and that on quiet nights, faint cries could be heard from the lower floors. Writers, dramatists, and later filmmakers drew from her story, reimagining her as both a monstrous figure and a tragic emblem of corrupted morality. In these retellings, fact and invention blurred, but the core remained: a respectable woman had turned her home into a chamber of horrors, and she had done so with the tacit permission of the society around her. For some, the story was a ghost tale to be told in low voices. For others, it was a moral reckoning. Either way, it refused to fade. Every few years, an anniversary article would appear in the papers, reopening old questions: had all her victims been found? had anyone else helped her? And most haunting of all, how many like her still walked unrecognized among the living? Closing reflection. Evil in disguise. Looking back, the most chilling aspect of the Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano case was not the cruelty itself, but how invisible it remained for so long. The mansion on Tuba Street was not an isolated ruin on the city's outskirts. It was a fixture in one of Mexico City's most prestigious neighborhoods. Its pink limestone facade and wrought iron balconies were admired by passers-by, who never suspected that beneath their feet human suffering was unfolding with surgical precision. Guadalupe did not look like the monster of popular imagination. She had no wild hair, no blood-stained apron, no fevered glare. She was composed, articulate, impeccably dressed, a woman who attended Mass, contributed to charity, and was welcomed in the homes of the elite. This is perhaps why her neighbors hesitated to act, why priests and physicians ignored their instincts, why police dismissed the missing girls as runaways. It is easier to see evil when it conforms to our expectations. Far harder when it wears the trappings of respectability. The case forced Mexico to confront the unsettling truth that morality cannot be measured by public image, and that the people most skilled at projecting virtue may also be the ones most adept at hiding vice. In the end, her crimes were possible not because she was invisible, but because she was seen exactly as she wished to be. The moral lessons. The legacy of the Beharano case is as much a warning as it is a history. It underscores the need for vigilance not only from institutions, but from individuals. Communities cannot rely solely on official channels to protect the vulnerable. They must be willing to speak up, to press uncomfortable questions, and to challenge appearances that do not match reality. The case also revealed the dangers of a society stratified by class, to the point where justice itself bends toward the wealthy. Had the families of Casimira Juarez, Elena Santos, or the Vega sisters been members of the elite, their disappearances would likely have sparked immediate investigation. Instead, their poverty rendered them invisible until their suffering could no longer be denied. For modern readers, the lesson is clear: systems will fail unless they are actively held accountable. This means not only laws and reforms, but a culture that values truth over reputation and the protection of the powerless over the comfort of the powerful. It also means recognizing that predators often position themselves where trust is most freely given: schools, churches, charities, or, as in this case, the very network meant to provide young women with opportunity and safety. Evil, in other words, does not lurk only in the shadows. It often sits in the front pew, echoes in the present. Today, more than a century after her death, Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano remains a figure suspended between history and legend. Some historians treat her as Mexico's first documented female serial killer. Others argue she may have been one of many whose crimes never reached the record. In Mexico City, the site of her mansion has long since been rebuilt, but the street retains a faint notoriety among those who know the story. Locals tell of workers who fled during renovations after hearing cries from the foundation, or of nighttime passers-by who swore they saw a tall, black-clad woman watching from an upper window where no light burned. Whether these are ghost stories or the stubborn persistence of memory hardly matters. The effect is the same. They serve as reminders that the capacity for cruelty does not fade with the passing of years. The systems that failed her victims are not relics. They still exist in different forms wherever power shields itself from scrutiny. And so the question lingers not as a relic of the past, but as a living challenge. How many Guadalupe Beharanos walk among us today, cloaked in respectability, their true nature hidden behind locked doors? The answer may be closer than we want to believe.